1957 there. I don't think there's anything particular for me to add beyond the comments we already made. The next one over here is a 1950. In 1950, International Harvester came up with a Demonstrator program, and they painted a bunch of Cubs, Super A's, and C's white to draw attention to them. The idea was that the dealers were to take the white tractors out and demonstrate them and get more visibility in the community. And they were supposed to demonstrate the white ones, sell red ones, and when the white ones were finally sold, they were supposed to be repainted red as well. And so if you go out looking, you can on occasion find a Cub that's red, but start looking closely, you can obviously see that it had been white at one time. That's the story behind it. We don't really know just how many of those were made, but they were made during the first 3 months of 1950. And those 3 months would have represented about 6,000 tractors. And it appears that all of the white tractors were made in that time period, but there were also red tractors made in there as well. So it's something less than 6,000 that were originally white. And of course, a lot of people have made their clone versions of them, take a tractor, any tractor, and put white paint on it. And so you'll find, 1949 models that somebody's painted white, 52 models that somebody's painted white. But the ones that originally were from the factory were all during 1950.
So you see about 6,000 of them were made, but I think I've seen 10,000 of them on eBay.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that program, the white paint was done on specifically those three models, Cub, Super A, and C, and that was it. If you see a white H or white M, and I've seen them, the factory didn't do that.
You don't suppose you could find out how many actual dealers there was at that time, and they made just enough for one for each dealer?
It appears that the initial batch of them, that may have been what their intention was, to just make one or two for each dealer. But what would happen, and this actually matched earlier company policy, is that people would want the tractor that was demonstrated. The dealer would quote him a price, the guy would say, okay, fine, but I want this one. And so what would typically happen is they'd take it back, put the red paint on it, take it to him, and then they'd be saying, hey, IH, we need another white tractor. And that may be the reason that there were multiple batches of white tractors. I think they did one batch thinking that was going to be enough, and then later on, the dealers wanted more white tractors because they'd sold their demonstrators out from under the sales line. And so there were more made. But I think that what you said, of one per dealer, or maybe, one and a few extras per dealer, may have been the original intention.
Okay. Was the white one just a standard tractor? Were there any other enhancements?
No, they were just the standard tractor. And that's another thing, is that demonstrators, and for years you'd find this at car dealers as well, they would tend to load them up and put lots of features on them. Like if you went to a car dealer looking for a demonstrator version of the car, it was going to be the one that had electric windows and power seats and all that stuff. This was not done that way. It was the standard mix of models.
So if the guy wanted to keep it, it was just because he already had it on the car.
It could have been. Well, and there was a lot of folklore floating around back then and before then that dealers would demonstrate tricked up tractors, that they were, they'd been fixed, and there were companies that did that. They would, they'd take a tractor out and demonstrate it, and they'd have, the headlights on it and all this stuff, and then they'd sell, okay, we're selling you a Model 9N with standard equipment. They'd haul that away and they'd bring back one that didn't even have a starter on it. And then, well, that was the standard equipment. So they would do that, and then they would do things to trick up the engines. They might plane the head, use better fuel, things like that to up the power. And so there was a general feeling among many farmers that you want to get the one that's the demonstrator because it's fixed. And so, when IH came up with this, demonstrate the white one and sell the red one, it was counter to that concept. And so I'm sure that was one of the reasons that the people would want the white one that had been demonstrated to be the one they got.
The old bait and switch thing.
Yeah, and Harvester had a strong, long-standing policy to not do anything to trick up a piece of machinery before it was demonstrated. they always said make sure it's properly adjusted, make sure it's running properly, make sure it's adjusted for the farmer's conditions, make sure you get the right size tires on it, but don't do anything that took it out of standard spec. And so this sort of folklore kind of thing kind of ends up building and having effects on things later on. And one of the effects, I think, was that people would want the tractor that had been demonstrated in their field. And so they ended up needing more demonstrators than they expected.
The day somebody said, oh, I like the white one. I want that white one. I don't want to take it back in.
There were a few that happened to. Once in a while, you come across an original white tractor that has never had any red paint. It's unusual, but every so often one will pop up. But as far as there being anything unusual about this compared to the red tractor, it just is white paint, and they didn't even, if it was a part that got put on after it went to the paint booth, it was still red. And that's the reason you see red steering wheel, you can almost see the red seat, you got the red headlights and the red front wheels. It's because those parts were bolted onto the tractor after the main tractor unit came through the paint booth.
When somebody ran out of a plow, did they just simply paint a red one white, or did they wait for IH to supply one?
There could have been some dealers that would go ahead and paint one white themselves, although I would think that would have probably been very unusual. I've never actually seen a documented case of that, but when you got thousands of dealers out there, who knows? More likely that it just demonstrated a red one and been yelling at the zone office to get them a white tractor. That's about it as far as what I can say on that one, I guess. It does appear that the paint on that really does pretty well match the way it would have been in the first place, as far as what's red versus what's white on that tractor. Okay, here we've got a, it says 48, that sounds very believable. Cub, so it's one of the fairly early ones. It's got the hand lift on it that we were talking about earlier, and it's got a snow plow. There were, depending on how you want to count it, there were 3 or 4 different versions of the snowplow made for the Cub. The first one was simply called the Cub Leveling and Grader Blade. The second one they called the Cub 54 because it was 54 inches wide. And this is that version, that second version. They made this version from about 48 or 49 through, I think, 51, maybe 52. It was vastly improved over the original one. Still not as nice as the later one, but it was a pretty good, effective blade. It was made so they could be mounted up front like this, or by reversing the drawbar, you could bolt it underneath and use it as a belly blade for grading. Actually made a pretty good grading blade. You could do a pretty good job of leveling things with it. So that's basically what the story is on that. Angling and tilt were all done by hand with just pulling pins and moving things. So angling and tilting was possible, but not really convenient. But you know, it did do the job.
What were some of the improvements over the original?
Almost everything.
And, when they changed this, that one that was offset, when did they do that? You know?
Well, the original, like he was asking about, just had a flat bar that came up here. There was a single rod made out of round stock that went from here down to the center of the blade. This had a double bend in it to bring it over in line with it. So with that single, it was not very stable sideways. And let's see, the hookups on the back were a little different. And instead of having these braces coming together on that bracket, one brace came up on one side of the bell housing and the other on the other. There was one bolt on each side of it. And these two straps under here were not present on the first one. And instead of having a pin here, it had a bolt. So if you wanted to change the angle, you had to take the bolt out, and then this thing fell on the ground, and you're holding 5 things at once trying to put the bolt out. Really not that good for something you want to change the angle of. But for just snow plowing, you just set the thing up and go. It was fine. But it really was not nearly as nice a blade to work with as this one. You see a row of holes across the top edge here. There was an optional snow extension to add a 6-inch piece to the top so the snow wouldn't spill over the back. That was available even on the other one as well. So that was kind of the differences from the first to the second. Now, when this one was replaced, which was in like 1952 or so, at that point it was vastly improved. And those are the ones that have the pressure spring in here. So instead of being V-shaped, you had more of a Y shape with a spring in it. The lift bar here had a double bend from back there and another one up here to get things in line. So that was when that came along. There was an extension that went on the bell crank here that changed with each version. That got a little nicer. And at that point, they came up with what they called the substitute drawbar to go onto the back so you could belly mount it and still have your drawbar on the back. So you could still use the drawbar as a drawbar even though you had the blade mounted.
What was the model number of it?
That was also a Cub 54. So to add confusion, not only did they almost change the entire thing, they didn't change the model designation at all. Then later on, the next version came along in about 54 or 55, and it was for fast hitch compatibility. The main difference is they had to change the substitute drawbar so that it wouldn't run into the fast hitch. And so they changed it and added a few other little brackets so you could flip around different directions to deal with the fast hitch being in the way where the substitute drawbar goes. And that one they called the Cub 54A. So that's where the A came in, was the changes for
That
fast
was the one
hitch.
with the little hook to hold your bracket back there, right?
That also would have been part of that. And so that, because that was there to hold up the fast hitch when you're using the blade. And to complicate things a little further, there are actually two versions of the substitute drawbar hardware, depending on whether you had the early or the later style fast hitch. So the first Cub 54A fit the fast hitch that had the lever type depth control. And then later on, they had to change it when the crank style came out so that it would work with it because those brackets had changed on the fast hitch. So then the later 54A was made so it would work with either style of fast hitch. It's kind of bizarre, but it's one of those things.
And also, didn't this, for a Lowboy, and this frame different?
Well, yeah, that gets to be a whole different thing when you start talking about the Lowboy. Because when the Lowboy came out, this stuff was all, too close to the ground. So most of these pieces here, and back there had to be shortened up for the Lowboy. The blade part of it, from this push frame on out, was the same, but all the rest of the parts were scaled and done a little differently to fit. And with Lowboy being low, it did not belly mount, it only mounted out front. And that was basically, what the changes were. And that was called the L54.
Were the blades made at the tractor plant or a separate plant? Or do you know?
Different plant. I believe that these were made in Rock Falls.
So they might not necessarily know what was coming out and they just had to react to it.
Well, the engineering departments, I'm sure, were keeping up with each other. A lot of the Cub parts, a lot of the Cub implement parts, not the tractor itself, came from Canton. Like the cultivators, the plows, and many of those things came out of Canton. The blades, I think, all came out of Rock Falls. And different things came different places. But,
You're looking at one, the easiest way I found at a quick glance to tell if it's for a Lowboy is this bracket right here. It'll only be about half this tall.
and the two braces have curve in them so that the tires wouldn't run into them, I guess, or so they could go around the pan.
Yeah. On a Lowboy, it won't stick. It would only be down about this one.
Not much more than half as long.
Hang under there.
And all that said, if anybody's got one, they will move snow like crazy. Man, they really work well.
They do a lot more snow moving than people expect them to.
Yeah.
Put a set of wheel weights and a set of chains on, you'd be amazed what it'll do.
Yeah.
You'd also be amazed
particularly
what
if you
will
got
happen
these-
whenever you're idling in third gear at about a half throttle and you hook a frozen rock too.
Yeah.
That steering wheel hurts. And I have sheared part of this shoulder off doing stupid things like that too, on this implement mounting pad. So you have to be careful. That is not a trip. That's just a shock absorber down there. And if you hit on the corner of the blade, either one, it don't move. And that tractor stops at about 4 miles an hour and about 2 inches, and you don't.
I was out with a guy bulldozing with a John Deere 850 crawler, and I said, well, look, mine's just as good. He was pushing about 1/4 of a blade length on his, and I was doing the same on the Cub. I said, mine's just as good as yours.
Hand lift on these worked good with the blade, but you couldn't ram into a bank of snow. You couldn't move that handle if you had to back out. Because that curved blade, you might have several hundred pounds of snow out there, and you could not move it. Now, I don't Jim say anything about the hand lift, but this spring you adjusted it for your weight, and they work good.
Yeah, depending on what implement you had on it, there's a vast difference in what the weight of different implements are. So you can adjust it to get it to counterbalance, and counterbalance to the amount that you felt comfortable with.
My personal experience, you want to keep just a little bit of implement weight. You could float it, but you want to keep just a little bit of implement weight, otherwise that handle sit there and chatter.
Yeah.
want to
You
keep just
don't
enough
want
weight
it
so it
tightened up
wouldn't
so
fight
far
and
that
bang.
it didn't require some effort. You wanted to have to pull on it a little.